when I first went to see a therapist, I kind of had in mind sort of this cliched idea of a therapist saying, "Oh, everything goes back to your childhood," and I was like, "Does it really all go back to your childhood?" And after a couple of years, I was like, "Yeah, yeah, it does." um, I love my parents dearly, and they were great, but they were young and they didn't know what they were doing. Um, by all accounts, I had a pretty good childhood, but one that with very, very little guidance. I had to figure a lot of things out on my own. Um, and when you do that, you learn ways of coping with the world when you're 5 or 8 or 12 years old, and you carry those forward. And by the time I'm 30 years old, the tools of my 8-year-old self aren't helpful anymore, but they're so ingrained that it takes a lot of work to get out of that habit. Um, so, yeah, I think, where I was 5, 10 years ago was in a place of needing to realize that my coping mechanisms that worked when I was 10 didn't work anymore, and I
Mm.
needed to find some new ways.
Mm. Which is hard to do, right? Because typically in the moments when you need those better coping mechanisms, it's
Hmm.
when that anger, that rage, or whatever is taken over. And in those moments, like, good luck trying
Yeah,
to,
and
resolve that.
it becomes a thing where it feels totally normal
Yes.
to have
Yeah.
those reactions because that's how you've always done it.
Yes.
And that was what finally got me into therapy was finally realizing like, oh, I'm down for a couple of days and then I'm better. I'm down for a week, then I'm better. Then like I'm down for like a month and whatever I've been doing is not working.
Mm.
Need
Mm.
some new tools and I just don't know what those tools are because
Mm.
everything I usually do is not working.
Yeah. If you try to like extrapolate that out about what it says about like humanity or human nature, because obviously I'm no expert on this by any means, but I think most animals in the wild, like there's certainly a period in which, at least for some of them, that they do need to figure out how to be a lion, right? And they'll practice hunting as a cub. Do
Right.
you like parallel it to that? Because it seems interesting to me that as humans, if you don't get guidance in some ways, like you start to form these habits that aren't right. Like, why can't we figure it out on our own? I guess is the
Hmm.
question. Like, why do
Hmm.
we need to be taught how to be human? Do you ever think about that and wonder why that is?
Um, I don't think I've thought about it in exactly those terms, but it is an interesting question. I maybe a lot of it just comes down to us being social animals. We're primates, and I think I wonder if you looked at a chimpanzee raised away from other chimps, how would that chimp act?
Mm.
You know, Other animals like lions have a lot of instinct. They work in groups, and it seems like their set of skills or interactions is a bit simpler than ours might be. I don't know if that's a fair judgment. Um, but for humans, we evolved to be social and to be in groups. And if we don't have a lot of guidance to being in groups, it can be difficult in a lot of ways when we're put in those groups and we have to learn to interact and we don't have a good model to figure out how should we be around our classmates or things like that. Um, if there's a genetic component to it, I don't know where it comes from. I definitely consider myself an introvert.
Mm.
Um, and why? I don't know. I spent a lot of time when I was alone as a kid, um, and that feels totally normal to me. But is it detrimental in some ways? I don't know. Maybe.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I can't, like, I always come back to this thought, and I don't know if it's right, but like our consciousness, our ability to have this conversation and even ponder these questions and think
Hmm.
about, like, hey, Sean, what happened in your childhood? What allowed you to get, what happened in mine, right?
Hmm.
Like, there's so much good and beauty in it, and it allows for innovation and unlocking new things and amazing things. But it also, I think, comes at the cost of like it's torturous. Like, it's us trying to explain things that likely we'll never fully understand. Like, I ask you that question, like, what is it about humans that makes that the case? The reality is
Yeah.
neither of us really know. Nobody really
Hmm.
knows, right? There's
Hmm.
so much about the human
Hmm.
mind we don't understand, the
Hmm.
universe in general. And like, to have this gift to be able to talk and think in this way is great and all, but it also leads to a lot of the issues because we're trying to figure something out that maybe was never meant to be figured out or was never meant to be questioned. but we
Mm,
can't help but do it. At least that's where I find myself often. Like I think that's why I do the show is like much like where you were before. I want joy. I want contentment. So like, all right, my tool to do that is let me think about and figure out how to create that. And that
mm.
comes with two sides to that coin, you know? So I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's definitely kind of a double-edged thing to have the ability to contemplate the meaning of life and probably never get a concrete answer. Um, that's something that I have leaned on a lot when I get into those modes of thinking is kind of the scientific minded approach of being comfortable with saying I don't know. I think a lot of people are not comfortable with that.
Yeah.
If there's some gap of information, it makes them extremely uncomfortable to leave that there. And for me, I have learned to be comfortable with not knowing and potentially never knowing. Um,
I
I would like
wonder.
to know for sure.
I like for me, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about it through that lens. I think what I struggle with most is not knowing like am I living a good life? I think for me
Mm,
that not knowing that seems like well then what do I do then? Right? Like
mm,
that seems like a tough one to not know the answer to. Like did I do enough today? And this goes right back to stoicism, right? I think stoicism
mm,
is meant to say don't beat yourself up about that. Like don't allow
mm,
yourself to get in your head in that way. Just focus on what you can control and what you do have. And I
mm,
get that. I think that's a lot of the value in it. But to that point about not knowing, I think that's right for a lot of people, myself, I'm sure included on smaller things. But on the biggest of things, like the meaning of life, that seems like such a big one to not know and to just accept, even like
yeah,
practically and like,
yeah,
tactically how
yeah,
we function.
yeah. Yeah, I think, the Stoics would say as long as you are living up to your own values and your values are doing good for the people around you, then you're living a good life.
Mm.
Um, you know, train of thought left the building and I wasn't on
Well, it might have been actually it was somewhat of a mic drop too, because that probably is the best answer in some ways, right? Like figure out what matters to you,
Mhm, yeah,
try and
yeah,
be that good person and do it. It's
mhm.
just there's so much like the devil's in the details, I guess, of like
Yeah.
how do you
I mean,
know? What does it look
yeah,
like?